Hello, this is Everybody Settle Down. I'm Charlie Marlow. That is the great Eric Messersmith. Eric, great to see you. It's been a while since we've been on the podcast together. How are you doing? And what do you think of the DNC and all the balloons, baby?
I'm doing great. My son loved the balloons. That was when he really got excited. At the end of Harris's speech and when the balloon drops, and I said maybe he's ready to support Kamala Harris. Look, I thought the Democrats did well, especially as the week went on. And I'll be honest with you, I think Harris. I don't know if I'd say it was a home run, but it was an extra base hit. I mean, I think she delivered and met the moment at a time when she had never done anything close to that scale. And a lot of Americans knew who she was. Obviously, she's been the vice president, but didn't know her well at all. And that was her chance with the biggest audience she's ever had, other than the debate, may ever have to introduce herself. And I thought she was very good.
Yeah, I think that's well said because I did see some people on X calling it a home run. And that might be a little heavy, but I think when you said extra base hit, now I have to ask, is it a double or a triple? But no, I think that's well stated. Like it was her biggest speech ever. And really, I'm sure she had some big speeches running in California and Senate and all that. But on a national stage, and it's weird to say this because she's been the vice president and she's had debates in the presidential primary and vice presidential debates and all that, but this was certainly the biggest speech of her career. And she could have flamed out, right? Like it could have been bad. It could have been poorly delivered. Now, she's not Barack Obama, she's not Michelle Obama, but I thought it was a really, really solid speech, certainly better than Joe Biden's. And if you go back and you contrast Trump's, I think you and I agreed Trump's at the RNC, the first 30 minutes were great. Then he just started meandering. It was way too long. Kamala Harris, it was a,
Yeah.
a 37-minute just kind of hitting the points speech. Not fantastic, not bad, but just steady and keeps her right there in this coin flip race, I think.
Yeah, when you contrast them, it is interesting because Trump was, I think, 92 minutes, longest acceptance speech ever. Kamala was a brisk 37. Trump started, it didn't end until after midnight. They got Harris on pretty quick. She was on like around 10:30, I think, 10:45, and was over by 11:30. So I thought from an efficiency standpoint, it was certainly better than Trump. Although, again, I did like that first half hour of Trump, but the second hour, if you remember, that was the point where I thought, Democrats can win this thing. If they dump Biden, they can win this because Trump has not changed. That was like 5 days after the shooting. And Harris, I thought last night, obviously I thought she could win coming into the speech. I mean, the betting markets and the polling are clear that she's either even or a slight favorite. But after the speech, I'm like, I would feel pretty good about it. And the reason is, it's interesting you mentioned Obama. My buddy texted me during the speech and he said, she's not Obama. He texted me about halfway through and he said, she's not Obama, but this is solid. This is workmanlike. It's logical. And I totally agree. I thought that's a smart take. That's exactly how I feel. Not Obama, but not. And then the last 15 minutes is why I say this was, I'd say a triple in terms of the extra base hit, because the last 15 minutes, this went from solid, doing what she needed to do, filling in the gaps of her background, attacking Trump, I thought, in a pretty effective way, laying out some broad policy. There weren't a ton of specifics, but she did stake some broad claims on policy ground, doing those things you need to do and accomplishing them efficiently. And then when she got to the foreign policy section, she came alive. Her energy, her delivery, the words she said. The line that really got me was when she said, "In the struggle between democracy and tyranny, I know where I stand, and I know where the United States belongs." And this was immediately after she ripped Trump, saying the dictators want him because they know he can be manipulated by flattery. And I just thought this was really effective, taking it to Trump on what's maybe one of his perceived advantages, which is his strength, right? He's this strong man who will protect us in the world. But when you look at policy, the modern Republican Party of Donald Trump has ceded that ground. Like for most of my life, Republicans were strong, had a strong advantage on foreign policy, on strength in the world. They were seen as the party that would bring strength, and they were trusted more to handle these things. Trump has changed the party. And you see that especially with Ukraine. It's like, well, maybe we'll help Ukraine, maybe we won't. Who knows? I'll come up with a magic peace deal. I kind of like Vladimir Putin, flirt with him a little bit. Maybe he can do what he wants with NATO, right? He's opened that door. And Harris smartly walked through it and said, no, I know what America should be, and I know where America should stand. And I thought that was one of several instances where Democrats this week smartly tried to reclaim areas the Republicans have tried to dominate. Patriotism, the flag. It
Yes.
may seem small, but the flag was everywhere.
Yes.
Religion. Raphael Warnock's speech the other night, I don't know if a lot of people saw it, the Democratic senator from Georgia, who's a reverend, talked about religion from the context of the Democratic side, right? Trying to take these things that Republicans just assume and take for granted that they now are the party of patriotism. They are the party, and the biggest one is freedom, which is literally the song, from Beyonce, who did not make a surprise appearance. That song is her song, and that is her theme. And she and others explained what they mean by freedom because Republicans have tried to take that too. And Democrats are like, no, wait a minute. How about the freedom to have elections that are free and fair and peaceful transfers of power? How about the freedom to not have people with AR-15 shooting up schools? How about the freedom to let women decide what they want to do with their bodies? You can agree or disagree with those things, but at least Democrats are taking that argument to Republicans. And I thought Harris tied that all together very well and delivered it incredibly forcefully. And like I said before, man, we'll see when you get into the meat of the campaign. I want to be clear. I'm not saying that she's going to be great the rest of the way, but I'm saying from the time she became the nominee, which was basically the day after Biden dropped out, until now, she and her team have delivered. And I think last night was kind of the capstone of that.
I've always said that Democrats shouldn't just allow Republicans to be all about the flag and religion. That was, you said it was a small thing. I don't think it was small. I think that was by design. There's this idea that you can tell if somebody's a Democrat or Republican based on if they have a flag in front of their house. You know what I'm saying? Like people have said
Mhm.
things like that, which I don't think is true, but maybe there's some truth to that. But I think that was by design. I think that was very smart. Another thing, guns. Now, if you watched, I didn't watch the whole freaking 20 hours of this thing. I watched more yesterday, which clearly guns was a big part of yesterday. And I want to get to Tim Walz' speech in a second. But if you listen to Tim Walz' speech, he said, I'm pro Second Amendment. And by the way, I'm a better shot than a lot of these Republicans,
Yes.
which was a nice line. But he said, I'm common sense, safety. And that's getting into background checks, red flag laws, and all that. So that's another thing that I picked up on. And I want to get to Tim Walz in a second, but my wife and I are watching this last night. It did come across hilarious, though, to me, and I think her too, that like this just happened so fast, right? With Kamala. Just think back. I know everybody on the right said, oh, she's the worst VP ever, which Democrats didn't think that. Moderates didn't think that. I think they said, okay, she's not very visible. But it is funny how, if you go back a couple months, several months, Democrats wanted an open primary. I still don't know if Kamala Harris wins an open primary. I don't think she does. But it's funny that go back a month, Joe Biden drops out. You're thinking, oh, could there be a challenger? Within 48 hours, it is Kamala and only Kamala. And 1 month later, everybody's got the Kamala balloons and the sticks. And now Doug, everybody loves Doug. You have the little posters for Doug. And it did feel so manufactured quickly, right? I'm just saying, like, the speeches were great, but it's just, you kind of had to laugh at how in 30 days she went
Right.
to a VP. She went from a VP who wasn't very visible to like the queen of everything. Like, it's pretty
Yeah.
funny.
It is funny, but it also shows you how parties should work and
Yeah.
movements should work. If you are, I just love how Republicans are still talking about this, like the switch and it was a coup. And it's like, what did they want? I mean, of course, we know what they wanted. They wanted the Democrats to stick with Biden and run a candidate who was almost certain to lose. That's clearly what they wanted. But no sane party should stand for that. And the Democrats didn't. And I understand, yes, it is weird and it is whiplash for sure. And you saw that with Biden Monday. And then not a whole lot of mention of him, a little bit here or there. Clinton, I thought, was one of the best at talking about Biden, but a lot of the speakers didn't really address it very much. He's the sitting president. He was the nominee a month ago. It is weird, but I think it speaks to the success of how well they've pulled it off, that it went so well. And look, this isn't just me saying it. I mean, there was a Gallup poll, okay? In Gallup poll of voters, Kamala Harris's approval rating, 34% in June when Joe Biden was the nominee. 34%. Pretty bad. Lower than Biden's was at that point. Now 47%. Her percentage among independents, which is key, went from 28 to 41. By the way, in this same poll that just came out from Gallup, where Harris's approval rating is 47, Trump's is 41. So they have executed it, right? Yes, the switch is weird, but the switch alone is not necessarily going to get you what you need. You have to execute it. And Biden deserves credit for that because he came out forcefully to pick Harris right away. If he didn't do that, if he would have just said that Sunday, I'm getting out and not said anything else, maybe we would have had a mini open process. I think we probably would have. I think somebody else would have gotten in. But because he did that and because Harris quickly worked to solidify everything, and the thing about Harris is we've talked about this before. Yes, she was very unpopular as vice president, in part because of how poorly she performed in some interviews, particularly early in the process, and because her presidential campaign was not good when she ran the first time. She didn't even make it to Iowa. But before that, right, she was a star, a rising star in the party. That's why she was thought to be a pretty credible presidential candidate in 2019. And so what they did, I think, effectively in this election, with the videos, were introducing her and others. You didn't really see anything about her presidential run in 2019 and 2020. And you didn't see a lot from her vice presidential tenure, which is 3.5 years. What you saw was, here's what she did when she was the attorney general of California, when everyone in the Democratic Party looked at her and said, she's going to be a star. Here is what she did in the Senate when she was grilling Brett Kavanaugh and others, like kind of reminding people, hey, Kamala Harris didn't arrive in 2019 when she ran for president. There were things that happened prior to that. And going back to her childhood and it doing her origin story, every politician needs to do that. That's part of a convention. I thought they did all that very well. Now, I want to be clear. As good as it was, and look, I think, and another thing I saw last night, and this is anecdotal. I just gave you the numbers, the scientific numbers. Anecdotally, CNN had 8 undecided voters in Allentown, Pennsylvania, right? Pennsylvania, probably the key state. Allentown, one of the key areas in Pennsylvania that will determine this election. They had 8 voters completely undecided heading into last night. 7 of them now are firm on who they're going to pick. And of those 7, 6 are with Harris, 1 with Trump, 1 still undecided. Now, that's anecdotal, but I think that speech was incredibly effective. She positioned herself as a middle of the road-ish candidate, someone who's more reasonable and more centered than Donald Trump is. And we talked about some of the reasons for that and reclaiming some of those areas Republicans have tried to take. That's what you have to do in politics. It's not enough to just talk about areas you pull well. Like, yeah, of course, Democrats are going to talk about abortion. They should, right? But that you got to go at the other candidates and say, hey, no, here's why they're actually wrong on the border. They talked about the immigration reform bill that Donald Trump killed. They had, I thought the police officer was very effective. The sheriff
Yes.
who was there in uniform talking about, hey, wait a minute. Which party is the party of law and order? Is it the party that supported the insurrectionists who injured police on January 6th? I mean, that's essentially what he was saying. Adam Kinzinger, the Republican congressman from Illinois, who's a conservative, Which party is the party of, some of the legacies of Ronald Reagan of a strong American role in the world? Yeah. So I think those were really effective things. But having said all that, I want to be clear. We still have not seen her do a long form interview where she's going to be asked, hey, wait a minute. When you ran for president, let me check my notes. 5 years ago, you called for defunding the police, abolishing ICE, universal health care with eliminating private insurance, the ending fracking, which is where we get a majority of our oil now in the United States and is incredibly important in, again, the state that will probably determine it, Pennsylvania. Like a minute ago, you were for these things and now you're not. Explain your evolution, right? What has changed your mind? Why do you feel so? There, she still has to pass that test, and then of course she has to pass the test of the debate. So this is, I'm not saying, I want to be clear, I'm not saying this is in the bag, but I would rather be Harris today than Trump.
Yeah, couple things on that. First of all, I probably react too much to some of the stuff I see on X. I don't let it seep into my brain and change my mind, but I probably consume a little too much of that For You tab. And I will say, again, I have no idea who's going to win. I think it's an absolute coin flip. I would probably agree that, and the betting odds show this. We'll get to this, but if Harris has a 2% better chance, whatever it is, it's so slim, 51-49, whatever it is. But what I have really noticed from a lot of the right wing pundits, because you know how this goes, they try to get the gotcha moments and the clips and whatnot. And I'll show these to my wife too, because I want different perspectives. Am I thinking wrong here? And I'll see these clips, and some of these right wing pundits will say, oh, here's Kamala getting totally exposed. Here's this word salad, right? Like she's not ready for prime time. And it'll be just like a 45-second clip that's totally normal. And again, you said extra base hit earlier. It would be like a single. It's not a strikeout. It maybe even is a double, but like I'm thinking it seems like they're really trying hard to make this woman seem really stupid and incompetent. And I know for years they show her cackling and everybody talks about the coconut tree and what being unburdened, whatever it is.
By
Like,
what, yeah, by what has
I don't
been.
even, right. I don't know all those, but I have noticed and I get a chuckle because I'll see this clip. It'll be 37 seconds. And it's like, here's Kamala talking at a rally. It's like, this is the worst thing ever. And it's just like totally normal political speech. Not bad,
Yeah.
not good, but just normal. And it's like, look, I'm not saying she's not Obama. She's not terrible. She's like a normal politician. They're just so trying to make her this socialist. She's an idiot. She slept her way to the top. She's just like a normal,
Right.
competent, pretty impressive politician.
What happens in the world we live in today, and it's always happened in politics, but it's especially true today with the algorithms, and as you mentioned, the For You tab, particularly on X, but all social media, is things play well in an echo chamber
Yes.
that don't necessarily, and in most cases, do not play well when you take it to a wider audience. And that's what happened with most of the attacks on Kamala Harris we saw the first 2 or 3 weeks of many of the things you just mentioned. They may work in ice. And also, the Harris people and her supporters did a great job of taking some of those moments and owning them, like the coconut tree thing. They didn't run away. They actually made that into a positive because it was
Mhm.
an interesting little story about her mother and the analogy, and it was kind of funny and relatable. And they made it into something that became a huge meme on their side. So those things aren't going to work. Like there's a lot of ways to attack a candidate, right? But there's maybe two broad ways. One bucket is personal attacks, personality traits, quirkiness, weirdness, if you're directing it at Vance or Trump, the wall says, right? The other bucket is issues. And the Republicans, I think, have put too much of their attacks in that bucket of personality or
Yes.
even race or anything that isn't related to issues. Those have almost all fallen flat. And the reason they've fallen flat is because you see the person, right? Everybody saw it. Well, not everybody. Millions of people saw that speech. Millions more will see the clip. That is not a stupid woman. That is not an unaccomplished woman. That is not some crazy radical. right? And you can see it. And so now Republicans have put a lot on she hasn't done an interview, which is a legitimate critique.
Yes.
I think it's less legitimate when someone wakes up basically yesterday and is all of a sudden the nominee and has to build up a political apparatus, select a vice president, plan for a convention, campaign around the country, raise money, get everyone on board in like 4 weeks, right? I think obviously if more time goes on and she doesn't do it, then I'll be right there saying, okay, come on, right? Because I'm big on politicians having an obligation, coming from the media background where I've interviewed lots of politicians, have worked in news. But even if I didn't, I just think in a democracy it's important to stand up and take questions and do sit down interviews. So I understand that critique, but the problem with that critique is when she does them, if she's pretty good, what are you going to say then, right? Like, you set her up, you set people's expectations to be like, oh, she can't do it, right?
Yes.
Which she can't do it. She's going to fall on her face. As soon as she gets tough questions, she's going to wilt and she's going to, come up with these word salads. And maybe you're right. Maybe she will. We haven't seen it, right? But if you're wrong, then that argument disappears and you've lost credibility with, again, the people that matter in the margins, right? It works for the base. They're already with you. So what if I were the Trump campaign, I would have, I mean, God, I would have ran this last 5 weeks completely differently. But going forward, I would be talking about the issues and I would be specifically hammering the issues Trump does well on: inflation, the border. I would be trying to tie her back to her previous positions. I would not be going down the road of, she's not smart, she's completely out of step with America. I just think that stuff, especially after the speech last night, those arguments are gone.
Yeah, I think you and I are pretty much in agreement. We saw your videos that were posted the last couple of days about RFK. We'll get to that. But also, even if you're a Republican, and I was talking to a Republican friend of mine, like, you can't deny that the Obamas are just, they're generational political talents. And look, a convention is just a series of speeches. You said that, and it's true. The Obamas, both of them, home runs. We talked about extra base hits. They were both home runs, but they're not running. So for me, the best speeches, and I didn't watch every single one, but I watched all of the keynote ones, the ones at the end. And so Barack and Michelle to me were the best. The one I was looking forward to the most actually was not Kamala, no disrespect, but Tim Walz, just because I don't really know anything about this dude. I'd never even heard of this dude really until about 2 months ago. And this is maybe getting back to the For You tab. There's also this idea that, like, how can you be a man and ever vote Democrat, right? How can you be a man and vote for Kamala Harris and all these Democrat dudes? They're all these betas and all that. And Tim Walz, everybody's calling him, the right's calling him Tampon Tim and all that. But this is like he's a dude who coached football and he teaches. He just kind of seems like your uncle. The Obama line about the flannel shirts is hilarious and it's true. Especially like if you see Josh Hawley was at the Missouri State Fair. He was wearing one of those flannels that probably cost $400. You know what I'm saying? Like a really
Right.
nice consultant flannel, whereas like Tim
Yes.
Walz probably has holes in his flannels. But anyway, I thought whoever wrote that speech, it was a pep talk. It was a coach's speech. And again, when you're kind of looking and like, okay, Donald Trump, he is a strong dude. He got shot at. He responded strong with the blood. Fight, fight, fight. I understand how people can get excited about that. But the way Tim Walz finished his speech and he made the football analogy, hey, look, you know, it's the fourth quarter. We are down a field goal, but we got the ball. We're marching. This is about blocking and tackling. Like, that was a pretty good speech. Like, the idea to frame it in a football mentality was really smart. And it was a nice, quick, I think the clip I watched was like 19 minutes, but like the first 2 minutes were cheering and the last 2 minutes. So it's probably like 15, 16 minutes, like easy to digest. I thought that was really well done by Tim Walz.
I do too. Look, I've said before on this show, I would have probably picked Shapiro. I think
Yes.
electorally that's the play because it's likely to be close. And again, Pennsylvania is almost certainly going to go to the winner and may just decide the whole thing. If you look at the polling, it's so close there. And Shapiro's great. I mean, I saw it's like his speech at the convention. However, I understand why they picked Walz, and I don't think it was a bad pick. And if for many of the reasons you pointed out, that I mean, it's so hard to demonize a guy who is a football coach, who is a gun owner, as he pointed out, a better shot than many of the Republicans, wears the flannel, like was in the National Guard, the military service. So I think he checks those boxes, and he doesn't check them in a way where he's pretending. Like you mentioned, Hawley, the senator from Missouri, who look, I'm not saying he's pretending, but he looks like he is, right?
No,
He
he is.
doesn't right. It doesn't seem authentic. With Walz, it's totally authentic. And I think that helps make the what I was talking about earlier. Democrats have a perception problem, right? In recent years, they are perceived to be the party of wokeism for what that's come to mean. A party that's policing your words and your thoughts. You can't say certain things. You can't think certain things. Or we want you to behave in certain ways. And I think what this convention was in many ways was the anti woke convention. This was the Democrats saying, "No, we're reasonable. We're patriotic. We're moderate, and we're not." And you saw that. Now, look, is that totally true? Not completely. Like that strain of the Democratic Party still exists. We saw it on college campuses, all throughout the spring, but you didn't see it in the convention hall. You didn't see the protesters. They were pretty much kept at bay. They weren't given speaking slots to people who were chanting, from the river to the sea, right? They weren't doing that. And not only it wasn't just that obvious stuff. It was a lot of subtle things too. Like Barack Obama talking about how you should listen to your relatives who disagree with you,
Mhm.
and you should hear them out, and you shouldn't belittle them. Bill Clinton made a very similar point too. And these are two of maybe the best politicians of our lifetime. And they understand this at an intuitive level. Like those were not woke speeches. Those were speeches of, hey, it's a country where a lot of people are going to disagree with you. Reach out to them, talk to them. At it, having Republicans like Kinzinger, like the mayor of Mesa, Arizona, in high profile slots in the prime time hour, giving that pitch, I thought was really effective. And one more thing on Walz, his son Gus, unbelievable, unbelievable. Who his son who has a learning disability, is nonverbal. When he got up, tears in his eyes, and said, "That's my dad." I mean, that was incredibly moving, and I don't know how you couldn't just see how authentic that was, and really slamming Walls home as this Midwestern family guy. I mean, I get choked up I mean, my son has autism, as we talked about before, is mostly nonverbal. I get choked up just thinking about it. That was an incredible moment.
All right, let's talk about the state of the race, which we've discussed a little bit. But as I look right now, Real Clear Politics polling average, Harris plus 1.5, which has trickled up a little bit. It was like 1, 1.1, 1.3. So it's plus 1.5 for Harris. The betting odds, I can show people here, 50.4 for Harris, 47.4 for Trump. If you look at the Electoral College, though, they have Pennsylvania right now going to Trump at like a 51.5 to 48.5. So, we can talk about Tim Walz all we want, but if the Democrats lose Pennsylvania, they're probably going to lose. And then we can look back, and even if Tim Walz was a great candidate, if Shapiro would have put them over the top, that's going to look like a huge miss. What I found interesting though was, I think if you go back like maybe 10 days ago, I remember I did a video. Harris had like a ten percentage point lead in the betting odds over Donald Trump. And then when this news, I feel like it was kind of the RFK endorsement news. All of a sudden, in the last couple days, you saw Trump with a 1%, maybe 2% lead over Harris in the betting odds. And now I'll show it again. Harris is back up 3 points. It's still a coin flip, but I think you see that Harris got a nice little bump off the convention, which we thought she would. But again, she had like a 10-point lead in the betting odds just last week or 10 days ago. So Trump has made this, and I don't know if it's real, but either way, this race is just super close.
Yeah. I think several things were happening. I think the first thing is the polling from basically the moment Biden dropped out up through the end of last week was consistently very good to very good for Harris, like
Mhm.
almost without fail. And her lead in the polling average kept ticking up, and her it was a big improvement pretty much every week when new polling would come out. And that kind of stopped late last week. It wasn't as if it completely reversed, but the momentum in the polling seemed to stop at the end of last week. And I think that's why you saw the betting odds change. Is it seemed like the race had kind of found a level, which was Harris ahead by about 2 or 3 points in the popular vote. But remember, popular vote doesn't decide it. And I think the key thing was Pennsylvania. There was some Pennsylvania in the polling that came in that showed it extremely close,
Mhm.
and that's probably the key for Harris because it seems unlikely she could win without Pennsylvania. Not impossible because she's put North Carolina back in play, which is critical because North Carolina has 16 electoral votes. So there is a world where Harris could lose Pennsylvania with 19 electoral votes, but win either Georgia or North Carolina with 16 plus Nevada, which has 6. And that would replace Pennsylvania, assuming she also wins Michigan and Wisconsin. So not impossible, but I'd say it's like 10% or less that she wins this election if she loses Pennsylvania. Certainly less than 20%. So I think that was happening. And then the RFK stuff started leaking out. And that I think really supercharged the odds moving back to Trump. What we don't know yet is we don't know what this convention bounce will be. I think she will get a bounce, but we don't know because there hasn't really been much polling at all this week. And there certainly has been no polling taking into account what we saw last night. We'll have to wait a few days for that. So we'll see what the convention bounce will be. Typically, candidates get a bounce of 2, 3, 4%. Some a little higher, some a little lower. So we'll see where it comes in. My guess is it won't be a huge bounce because we're so polarized, and I think so much of this is locked in. But I think she will get a bounce of a few points, and I think when and if she does, you'll see the polling odds move in her favor. And then, of course, the other big thing to watch is what you mentioned earlier. RFK, it appears, is definitely dropping out of the race. The New York Times reported last night that in Arizona, he has filed paperwork to take his name off the ballot. So it appears almost certain he's dropping out. But the big question is, does he just drop out and stay neutral? Or does he, I think, much more likely, drop out and throw his support behind Donald Trump?
All right, let's get into that right now. Do you think if he does that, this is a hypothetical, but we are recording this at 12:18 Central Time. So maybe as people start to listen to this, watch this tonight, maybe there's news on RFK Jr. Um, do you think this is a sellout move? Because here's a guy, he was the third party candidate, but remember also he wanted to run as a Democrat in the primary. I think it's fair to say the Democrats really did box him out. I've said a long time, many times here, that I think if RFK had a real shot at the primary, now it's different because Biden stayed in it, but I think if it was an open primary versus like the Shapiros and the Whitmers and the Newsoms of the world, there's a very good chance RFK Jr. with debates could have won that. I understand why he's so pissed at the Democrats and the party of his dad and his uncle for freezing him out. You can also say, hey, okay, if he aligns with Trump, if he really is somebody who wants to do good for the world, and in his opinion, if he could run the National Institutes of Health or whatever it is and have a cabinet position, if that's what he wants to do and he can make a difference that way by not being a president, I understand that line of thinking, but I don't know. To me, it feels a little sleazy. It feels sellout-ish to me. I like RFK Jr. I've said that. I don't know. I guess if you're going to drop out, you probably have to endorse someone. That's usually the way it goes. I don't know. It just kind of leaves me with like a lukewarm feeling about everything in his campaign.
Look, we've talked about RFK a lot on this podcast. I I have so many mixed feelings. Starting with this, I have a natural default to want more competition in politics.
Yeah.
So I want third party independent candidates. I would love ranked choice voting where we would have a chance to really open the door to more independent minded candidates. And so in general, I'm sympathetic to that. I also, as I've talked about, like RFK personally. But I mean, I think what's happened with RFK is what I predicted would happen all along for two reasons. Number one, third parties always fade. The only possible exception to that was Ross Perot in 1992. And even he faded because in the summer, there were polls where he was ahead in that year. And the reason they fade is obvious. We have a two-party system for a reason, right? Because it doesn't matter what percentage you get, it's do you win or not. And so people want their vote to count. Part of it, too, is RFK started getting more exposure. There were more profiles about him. People looked into his record more. John Oliver, I mean, look, I did a kind of a mini, I wouldn't say takedown. I did a mini fact check on him in our last podcast for 15 minutes or whatever it was. RFK people hate me. I'm not going to do that again. All I would say is go watch the John Oliver, Google John Oliver RFK Jr. He did a 30-minute takedown of RFK. Fact, again, I know the RFK people don't believe in fact checks. One of the fact checks, I can't remember if it was factcheck.org or PolitiFact, did are you ready for this? 3-part series on only his vaccine comments. And each part was lengthy. It was scrolling. I mean, the man has built this persona, which I think is mostly bullshit, on him being this truth teller, right? He's above the two-party system. He stands in this void where he's give me a break. So again, and that's me saying this is someone who finds him interesting and smart and likable, right?
Well,
I think
hold
all
on,
those
real
things
quick.
can be true at the same time.
Real quick. He did want to run as a Democrat, though, to be fair.
He did.
He did want to.
And he wanted to run as a Democrat, and the Democrats made it hard for him. I mean, let's be honest. That's what they did. And that's what political parties often do when you try to challenge an incumbent president. Hell, they sometimes do that even when there isn't an incumbent president. Ask Bernie Sanders about what happened to him in 2016 running against Hillary. But here's how you know the guy is not what he pretends to be. He reached out to the Harris campaign. That's the Washington Post saying this. Now, I know the Kennedy people will say, well, I didn't hear that from Kennedy's lips. The only thing I can believe is what RFK Jr. tells me is true. Yeah, sure. Here's what the Washington Post story said, okay? So the Washington Post publishes a story last week that RFK wanted a meeting with Harris, considering dropping out of the race, trying to position himself for some role in the future, right? Here's a quote from Washington Post. After the initial publication of this story late Wednesday, this is last week, Kennedy and his campaign confirmed the outreach to Harris to other news organizations. On Thursday morning, however, he dismissed the idea of endorsing Harris in a social media post. I mean, come on. So Harris rebuffs him. Now he goes to Trump. Apparently, look, maybe I want the caveat here because by the time you hear this, maybe he will have decided something different. And if he doesn't endorse Trump, I will come back and say good for him. Good for him for having integrity and for standing up for some type of principle. But if in the likely event he does endorse Trump, he reached out to Harris. You and I talked about the New Yorker piece where text messages, which to my knowledge, he has not denied. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I missed it. He's not denied that I've seen that in text messages, he called Trump a sociopath, barely human, among other things. And now it looks like, again, maybe I'm wrong. I hope I am. He's going to kiss the ring after being rebuffed by Harris. Like this is the defender of decency and honor and integrity. This is the man that he's a fraud. He's been a fraud. He remains a fraud, right? He in many ways, by the way, that doesn't make him unique in politics. He's looking to get his beak wet, right? He wants to put himself in that position. That's what happens. My problem isn't even that he's doing all this. My problem is he portrayed himself to be something other than what he's doing now, right? Also, the other thing I wanted to talk about was what effect it will have. Because to me, that's, obviously the even more important thing is where do his voters go? When it was a Biden-Trump race and he was getting 10% roughly nationally, it was pretty clear he was helping Trump. Biden was doing worse when RFK was included than he was head-to-head. That has changed. And it doesn't show up too much in the national polling. Like if you look at the national polling, Harris-Trump, and then Harris with the big field with RFK and others. It's pretty similar. But in the swing states, Cook Political Report had swing state polling last week where Harris was leading, I think in 5 of the 7 swing states and tied in 1. The lead was small for the most part head to head versus Trump. But when you included RFK, she was gaining in a lot of those states 2-3 points, which is a huge difference, right? It was the difference between her up 1 or 2 or her up 4 or 5. And Cook has come out and asked the RFK voters about who they would support in those swing states. 45% said Trump if RFK wasn't in. 26% said Harris. So that's a pretty big gap. And that's asking them without RFK dropping out and endorsing Trump. So you would assume if he doesn't just drop out, but he says, hey, this is the guy. To my supporters, if you like me, you need to put yourself with Trump. If he does that, which again, I expect him to, we'll see, I would think that number would go even higher. Now, look, it's 2 or 3% of the vote right now that he's getting in most of these states. It's not a lot, but like we talked about with Shapiro, if it's close, everything matters. And so just like not picking Shapiro, it may not matter at all, but it also may cost you the whole thing, right? That's the thing of a close election. And so I think that's really interesting. Also on RFK, I mean, in a way, I'm even kind of surprised that he even flirted with the Harris campaign at all. Because if you've been, we talked about this before, the media he goes on, the way he portrays himself, at one point earlier this year, downplaying January 6th, which he did. Look it up. He did. I'm sorry. We've heard it. He said it. Saying Biden was a bigger threat to democracy than, I don't know, the guy who for 2 months tried to overturn an election and summoned a mob to Washington, D.C. that then tried to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power. The other guy is more of a threat to democracy. The conspiracy theories that he embraces, in many ways, this is who RFK is, right? So in that regard, it's a pretty natural fit that he and Donald Trump would go together. But it's just another one of these people, and most of them in the Republican Party, they know who Donald Trump is. I mean, we talked about the text messages from the New Yorker piece. Like, RFK Jr. is not a stupid man. He knows who Donald Trump is, right? But what does he want? Power. And that has been the story of the Republican Party since Donald Trump, became the nominee and became the president, is you basically had 2 choices. You either got the hell out of the party, you left or were kicked out. Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, Jeff Flake, others, Mitt Romney to some degree, or you bent the knee, right? That was it. Those were your 2 choices. Most of the people bending the knee, there are some true believers. Like, I think Marjorie Taylor Greene is a true believer. I think Lauren Boebert, I'm not saying there aren't some true believers who actually think Trump is this, generational figure who is this incredible person who will bring, do amazing things. But I think most of them, like the Mitch McConnells of the world, the Brian Kemps, the governor of Georgia, they know who he is. But they like power and they understand what you have to do to play the game. And again, I think that is weak. I don't think it's patriotic, but I understand it. And I wouldn't even be that upset about it if RFK Jr. hadn't been, for a year now, portraying himself as something different. It's the hypocrisy to me of RFK more than what he probably will end up doing.
Yeah, I agree with that.
End rant.
I love it. No, I will say, and I've not been a Trump guy, but I did say I thought Trump was a pretty dang good president until January 6th. So I will push back and say there are some people, though, who don't love Trump and they just say, you know what? I don't love everything he does. I think things were better. Even if you disagree, they might say, hey, I think things were better in foreign policy. I had more money. Now, we don't have to get into why there's inflation, but you can understand, and they can say, hey, I'm a conservative. I'm going to vote for the conservative. I get that. I understand that. But I agree with you on RFK specifically, because if you go back a year or so, he was kind of the alternative media. He was the podcast guy along with Vivek. He was on every podcast. He was talking for an hour, 2 hours, and there were great conversations. I watched and listened to many of them. But even though he was at the time, he's trying to be a Democrat and see what happens. He did come across as kind of the disruptor, the third party guy. And I will say this: I don't think you can be as mad as him, like let's say choosing Trump over Harris based on if you want Trump to win or Harris to win. To me, it's more about I think what was really exposed in the last 10 days or so, and here's where I agree with you, is that he's a politician. He's a politician like everybody else. And I don't hold any of these politicians on a high pedestal. I really don't. But at the end of the day, if you run this campaign where you do play both sides, by the way, like you brought up the whole thing about Biden being a bigger threat to democracy, and you're going to get comments on this because they'll always say, no. They'll say, RFK said, I could make the argument.
Yeah,
That's what
right.
he
I
said.
could
I
make the
could make the
argument.
argument that
Yeah.
Trump is not as big of a threat as Biden. But it was this whole playing both sides the whole
Yes.
time. So I guess it shouldn't surprise me as much that in the last 10 days, he is flirting with both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. I will say, if he truly believes in service and he feels like he can still serve the country with how he looks at some of this medical freedom, okay, I think there is something there. I truly believe that he believes in these causes. But at the end of the day, if you did think he was the shining white knight who was
Right.
bigger than all of this swamp, he's still a Kennedy, right? And at the end of the day, if you're basically bartering for the best deal with the Democrats and the Republicans, he's pretty much just like everybody else. I think it's fair to
Yeah,
say.
he is. No, exactly. And you I'm glad you brought that up because it made me think of something else. You brought up the interview. I believe it was on CNN where he said, "I could make
Mhm.
the argument that Biden is
Yes.
the bigger threat to democracy." That is such a weak way to say it. But that is what and this is one of the critiques I have of RFK from a general perspective is when you are intelligent and you are articulate and he is both of those things, you can make anything sound good, right? And that's what he does. He makes conspiracy theories and some crazy ideas sound okay. And one of the ways he does it, which is smart rhetorical tactic, is he uses qualifiers like the Biden thing. And on vaccines, he is the expert at it. He'll say, I'm not anti-vaccine, and then he'll launch a tirade. And again, just I'm not even going to get into it again. I know people don't believe political fact checks, but just I don't know, try it. Go to Google and go to PolitiFact and read part of the, again, 3-part series on his misrepresentation and lies about vaccines. Or if you don't want to read it, watch the 30-minute John Oliver show. He does an amazing job. But anyway, my point is, it would be like me coming on and be like, Charlie, I'm not anti-cheeseburger. And then I ripped cheeseburgers for 20. I've never eaten. I wouldn't eat one. They're not tested. I don't know. I think maybe the non-meat products are better. Have you seen what they're doing with cows? But I'm not anti-cheeseburger. No, cheeseburgers can be fine. They can, and that's what he does. He starts with it's almost like a something to inoculate him when he says and that the RFK Jr. people, that's what they'll say. They'll be like, well, he said he's not anti-vaccine. Right, he did. He also said a litany of things about vaccine going back years that are either completely untrue or are devoid of any context or are misrepresenting the results of studies, right? So you can't just do that and again, this isn't a one-off where he said it once. You can't do that for years and even decades and then come and say, but I'm not anti-vaccine. And that like somehow inoculates you. I mean, it's ridiculous. But on the other point you made about voting for Trump, I want to be clear. I can totally understand how someone would vote for Donald Trump, even if they weren't a huge fan of his personality traits, shall we say, right? I mean, look, the reason this race is really close is because one of the reasons prices have gone up 20% in the last 3 years. I mean, it wouldn't matter who the president or the challenger was. It wouldn't matter which party was in the White House and which one party was trying to take it. If the incumbent party presided over a time when prices went up by 20%, they would be in some trouble. I mean, that's just no matter what else was happening in the world, that's just the reality of prices going up that quickly for Americans, right? It's one of the worst things that could happen to an incumbent presidential party. So you and I have talked about some of the context of that, but putting that aside, I understand that. What I'm talking about though are not the everyday voters who have seen their prices go up, or maybe wealthy people who want a tax cut, or people who are really, really concerned about the border and want something done with that. I totally get that. What I'm talking about specifically are people who are in the game. RFK Jr. and specifically Republicans in Congress, right? And specifically, I'm thinking the Republicans who were there and had to run and hide on January 6th of 2021 because a mob was coming chanting, hang Mike Pence. I'm thinking about Josh Hawley sprinting through the hall. We talked about him before of the Senate, right? That's who I'm thinking of. And then the same
Mhm.
people who come back and support this guy, knowing what they know. Having most average voters have never met Donald Trump. They've not been in meetings with him. These people have. That's where I draw the distinction. I would never criticize voters making the decision based on their economic situation, the border, whatever issues they feel are important. That's every voter's right. I have respect for that. I'm talking about these people who know better and know what they know and have access to information that most of us don't and decide to support this guy anyway. I think history will look back very, very unkindly on them.
All right, let's wrap it up, you RFK hater. Anything in your notebook? By the way, I just want to say I've said this 10,000 times, but I will say it again just in case we have a new viewer or listener. My thing on RFK is more big picture. It's not just really it's not even about the COVID vaccine. It's about big pharma for profit medicine not looking out for people's best interest, the government. You can go back to OxyContin. With these companies are not liable. It makes sense for them to keep us sick, to keep us fat. We have all kinds of chronic disease issues in this country, and that I've said this 5,000 times. But with me, I think RFK is on to something big picture. And I've said a million times, I don't agree with everything, every vaccine thing he brings up, COVID vaccine, but I do think he's on to something big picture. That's my last qualifier before
No,
I could make the argument, Eric. I could
right.
make the argument that you should open your notebook
Yeah.
right now.
And just to be clear, you're not anti-vaccine. I think
I'm not.
no, right. You always have to use that qualifier too, right? I'm
Well,
not anti-vax.
I'm not
No, I know what you mean.
anti-vaccine, but I think I mean, he makes a good argument when he
He
says,
does.
why was the schedule 6 back then? Why is it 72 now? Why are the babies getting it so early? Can we talk about this? That I think is a
Yes.
totally fair argument.
And I want to be on the record, and I've said this before. I agree with pretty much everything you've said over the last several minutes. And I just wish there was a better messenger,
Yeah.
right? Like big ag is terrible for this country. Basically, this is kind of one of the things Kamala Harris talked about, by the way, when she got knocked for quote unquote price controls, which is not what she said. What she said is we need laws against price gouging and
Mhm.
antitrust in the food industry, and specifically the meat packing industry. Four companies, four giant conglomerates. This isn't mostly now small farmers anymore. This is four giant companies that control, I think it's 80% of the meat industry in this country. And RFK talks about that. He talks about big ag. He talks about the power of the pharmaceutical companies and some of the harms they have caused. And I think those are incredibly important topics. I'm glad he has brought them up. I support him talking about that. I wish more politicians would. Some are starting to. I wish even more would. I just wish there was a better messenger for that. Is my point. In terms of anything else I wanted to touch on, look, the Trump coup talk, and we've talked about this before. I mean, if this is the game, man, if you remember in 2020, it started before the election. I can't lose unless it's rigged,
Mhm.
right? He may have said that exactly, but he certainly paraphrased that. This was prior to any votes being cast. This is the pretext. It was a it was a coup that Kamala Harris was installed in Biden. I was beating Biden. I would have won that. Now, if Harris wins, they did something wrong, right? Now, of course, that's not true. The nominations decided at the convention. Biden was never the nominee of the Democratic Party. They didn't take it from him, right? He was not the official nominee, but it doesn't matter. It's about setting a pretext, any pretext, in case you lose that you. So I mean, look, let's just be aware of it now, right? Because this is something you're going to be hearing about. I guarantee it. If Trump loses this election, Nikki Haley. This happened maybe a week or two ago, but between our shows, she went on Fox, and it was on other interviews as well, basically saying what we've been saying, which is stop talking about Harris's race or any of these personal attacks and focus on policy, right? And I thought she did it very effectively, and I thought she attacked Harris pretty effectively. It just made me think, what if Republicans had picked her? Like we talked about it before, any generic candidate running against an incumbent party, because Harris is not the incumbent, but she's part of the administration, running against an incumbent party where prices, again, regardless of the context, prices up 20% in 3 years, border pretty chaotic for up until the last few months. What if Nikki Haley would have been the nominee? I mean, I don't know. Maybe she'd still be down like Trump is a couple points, but I don't think so.
I think
I
she
think
wins.
Nikki I think Nikki Haley would be winning this race right
Yeah.
now, and I think she would have a very good chance to win. And I just think, again, it goes back to the Trump talk we've had before. That if he loses, and again, I would rather be Harris than him today, but certainly there's a lot of time left. It's going to be a hell of a reckoning for the Republican Party. I mean, it really will. If they lose this race, again, take the people out and just go with the fundamentals and plug someone else in, particularly someone who is as talented and kind of appealing to people in suburbia as Nikki Haley is, it's a race you very well could have won. And again, Trump could still win it. He's right there. But I just think we are underestimating the immense reckoning that is coming for the Republican Party. And the reason we're underestimating, I think, is because it looked pretty certain he was going to win for a while. Republicans felt like they had it in the bag with Biden, and they probably did. And so I think it's just now dawning on everybody pretty slowly that, oh shit, right? We could lose this thing. And what would that mean for what the Republican Party has become over the last 4 or 8 years? That's just that's obviously a subject for a different day. But watching Haley effectively make the case against Harris and explicitly tell Trump, hey, this is what you should be doing, made me think about the larger ramifications of how we got to where we are and how it could have been different.
Yeah. I think, again, I'll say that I think Donald Trump was a pretty good president until COVID messed up the whole world. And then January 6th, that's where I'm out on that. But I do think it's important to note, if we're talking about political power and we're talking about elections, if Donald Trump wins this, he changes the entire narrative of everything. I mean, he's the winner, he's the king. But if he doesn't, you will look back and you'll say that from an election standpoint, Donald Trump only helped Republicans one time, and that was
Yep.
8 years ago,
Yep.
2016. It has been a long time. Go to the midterms. So you go to 18, 20, 2022. You go to the special elections in Georgia. You go to all these special elections for abortion in every state. And you can make the argument that the Republicans were stepping on a lot of rakes and a lot of
Yeah.
unforced errors by continuing to go with Trump when he has not really helped them gain power in 8 years.
Right. And that's the argument that is so interesting is it's one thing to look the other way and essentially sell your soul to someone who wins, right? And ushers in massive majorities. And you're like, well, you know what? I had to compromise my ethics a little bit, but look, we're crushing it. We've got these big majorities in Congress and the presidency. We're getting stuff done that I support. So I'm fine making that compromise. It's another thing to do that for someone who is a consistent loser, who, as you said, gets destroyed in the 2018 midterms, who loses as an incumbent in 2020 with a record economically, as you mentioned, that was pretty damn good for 3 years up until COVID, but still blows that election, blows the special elections in Georgia that flips the Senate, backs candidates who, in many cases, are extreme in 2022 and causes you to underperform dramatically against Biden, who was still an unpopular president at that time, and then comes back again. And as I said, an election where if you nominated somebody like Nikki Haley, you probably win. And if you go on to lose that election and you've essentially changed your party into something that is unrecognizable from what it was, 15, 20 years ago for essentially this man, and he doesn't win. That is a reckoning that will take years for them to recover from if it happens.
That's a lost decade. It's
It is.
almost literally a lost decade. Well said. Let's end on that. Everybody settle down. Please comment, like, subscribe, share the videos, share the shows, share the channel, put them in your group text, put them on social media. That is the RFK hater, Eric Messersmith.
Hey,
I'm the guy who can make an argument that RFK
you
might be a
can't.
good guy.
You
Charlie
know, I
Munger.
will say I will say this to RFK people. I do read the comments. I don't engage, and I'm not the engage comment guy, but I do read them. So send me the hate. It's okay. We can agree to disagree.
And real quick, because I do want to end, but I will say this is also anecdotal, but I've seen a lot of the RFK commenters in the last couple days also pissed if he bows out. And
Yeah.
I don't know
You
if it
should
matters.
be.
Right. I don't know if it matters if it's because he's going to endorse Trump or if it would have been different if he was going for Harris. But I think there are a lot of people that were ride or die for him. Like
Yeah.
he was never going to back out. And they're also pissed right now, Eric. So you're
Yeah,
right.
absolutely. They should be.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.